Everyone. Welcome to Strength Within. If you're new here, my name is Aleesha Shimeld. I'm a psychologist with a passion for the serving member and veterans mental health space. And so I interview people who have had different experiences in defence, transitioning out of defence, what worked for them, what didn't, and in some cases, what they would change about the military if they were able to. Today, I've actually sat down with two people. I've sat down with a couple who were dual serving when they were in. Their names are Julie and Trent Kingston. They were both in the Army. Julie was an officer and Trent was a soldier. So they share their motivations for joining the military initially, and then some of the complexities of managing careers as a couple, the challenges that they faced, particularly regarding gender dynamics and support systems within the military. Their journey highlights the importance of co-location in their postings and some of the cultural barriers that still exist for men seeking to take on primary caregiving roles. Our conversation was able to explore some of the complexities of balancing military career with family life, the challenges of career management in dual serving families, and some of the emotional impact of transitioning from military to civilian life. I really appreciate Trent and Julie for taking the time to share some personal experiences and the insights that they have on navigating those challenges. To me, it really emphasizes the importance of self-advocacy when we're a member who is leaving, support within the organization, and really understanding one's worth, both in military and civilian contexts. Welcome to Strength Within, everyone, and particularly to Julie and Trent, who are a married couple that I am making be separated for the sake of my editing, and I appreciate that. They do, in fact, live in the same home, and this is the same home. I wanted to interview Trent and Julie because I thought that they're a really great example of something that we know exists all over the place, which is a dual serving couple. And they are both now officially out of the full-time ADF. And so they've had an interesting journey in that way. And I thought that there was something meaningful to talking that through from a couple's perspective, really. So I'm gonna go to Julie first and say, just briefly, can you tell me what your motivation was for serving to begin with? And then just a little summary of your career, which I know is long.
Why did I choose to serve? While cliched, it's a greater good and higher calling. Although I cringe when I say that out loud. I always enjoyed being outdoors, very active, didn't want to get tied to a desk job too early, and still wanted to study. Had gone to the ADFA Open Day and being paid to study, move out from home and pursue a more active career seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And so people will figure this out, and so you went on to become an officer, obviously.
I did, yeah. Graduated from RMC in Ordnance and Logistics, and then did multiple postings up and down the east coast of Australia, ending up as a lieutenant colonel in Canberra prior to being medically discharged.
Cool. Thank you for that. And I mean, it's a cliche, isn't it? But I was like, ending up as a lieutenant colonel in Canberra, I was like, yeah, that's like the law. That's how that works.
Yeah.
Trent, what about you? What kind of drove you to serve? Because you joined young as well. You guys both joined young. You didn't join together,
Yeah,
but you both
straight out of
joined
school.
young.
Yeah, so I suppose, like a lot of Australians, I have some family history. So both my granddads were in fought in World War II. My dad was in the CMF. Didn't get sent to Vietnam, but was ready to go in case. So there's always that idea. Finishing school, I wasn't exactly a high achiever at school. I did well, but probably not as good as I probably could have. And so I was just looking for something that sounded pretty cool. I suppose like all young boys, you grow up and go, oh, I'm going to join the army and do some cool stuff. Started looking down that path and ended up choosing a trade sort of thing. So I like the idea of, having actual qualification to leave with. And then ended up settling on aviation trades and in that avionics technician. So that was sort of how I sort of joined, my motivation for joining. In my 20 years, because I was only going to do the 6 years, and then that sort of just kept going and convinced to do some promotion courses and stuff like that and deployments and things. Posted various aviation units, had up and down the East Coast, worked on Black Hawks and MH90s and went to training establishments and I got out as a sergeant. So yeah, that's sort of my quick story.
Thank you. And I know Julie deployed as well, obviously, just for, I guess, for the audience there too. I think you, Trent, in particular, are a really good example of something that I feel like I tell people all the time, which is that what I like about the ADF in general, not just the Army, but that's obviously my beloved child. That's my favorite child of the three services. Is that the Army's a really good place where you can see firsthand that there are a lot of different kinds of intelligence. And that's definitely true in your case. Like you're sort of saying, oh, I didn't do that great. And I'm like, Yeah, but I've seen what you can do mechanically, and that's not nothing, right? Like, and this is a terrible example, and I acknowledge that this completely downplays the skill that you have, but it's just what stands out to me. Is I remember once that someone got my daughter one of those little like Chinese puzzle dragons, and she was 3. It was her godfather who he will listen to this, and like it was a bad choice, Rob. It was a bad choice. And so she pulled the eye out, and it just went like, and I was like, oh no, and I was really upset because I had it on the shelf. And then you just came in and you went boop, 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 boop. And I was like, how did you do that? And you were like, Leash, I put helicopter engines back together. And I was like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Yeah. Anyway, that is neither here nor there. And so you guys got together, I want to say kind of halfway in your careers. Is that right? If I got that maths right?
It's pretty early. It was like 2003.
Earlier. Yeah. So we met in Townsville in about, I think it would have been 2005, 2006.
No, 2004.
Oh, okay. Clearly, I'm all over dates.
Interesting too,
'Cause I-
because that's
We were
like,
already dating when I went to Pakistan.
2005.
Say so,
Yep.
darling.
here we are, strength within, causing divorces in happily married couples. That's my gift.
Yep.
Do you know what? It cracks me up even just you guys have just done exactly what I do, what my friends do, right? Which is you're not actually, you're not thinking of a calendar chronologically. You're using
Postings.
like where
That's
you
what
were to figure it out. You're like,
Postings
no,
and,
because I was in Pakistan, I was going
deployments.
here.
Yeah.
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 And then, and we're all of the same ilk in terms of the deployments, which is what you run into. And I have this constant argument with my spouse is he'll go, no, that's because that's when you were in the Middle East. And I was like, that was the first time. I'm talking about the second time. Like, and it messes up my calendar. I'm like, no, this is the wrong year.
Wedding date, but the year eludes me. And every time I have to pause to go back through my posting history to remember which year we actually got married. So I don't have a great track record with dates, really.
Different kinds of intelligence. So I guess one thing I'm wondering is, because we're talking more in the transition space deliberately, otherwise I could talk to you guys all day and would quite happily, but I'm wondering how much, I guess, the pressures of being a dual serving couple, how much, if any, did that factor into starting to think about getting out of the ADF?
Start, and then Trent will provide some of the detail. I think one of the things is, yes, we're dual serving, but also across soldiers and officers as well, and so that has its own complexities. And I know it's complicated regardless, but it meant that to have 2 successful careers, you're actually asking 2 halves of a career management agency to actually engage and discuss, and each have their own service needs. And I would say that was probably where we had a lot of tension and friction. So we decided early on that my career would arguably take precedence over Trent's. And then we always knew there would be a point of divergence where that wouldn't be able to be accommodated, and therefore we'd have to look at options. I think one of the frustrations was not having the career agencies or career management, career advisors talk. That was probably every posting cycle, every career interview, actually getting the 2 career managers to discuss us as a couple and us as a posting unit, I suppose. And the last time that we were posted, the answer came back. The first answer that came back was moving from the US with 2 kids, both under 5, was Trent's going to Darwin and I was going to Canberra. And our career, I know performer had always been co-location was our number 1 priority, regardless of what that meant for our posting opportunities. And that one probably was the hardest one for us to go back to the career managers and say, hey, you've got this wrong. We will be co-located one way or another. Luckily for us, that resulted in Trent's posting being changed to Canberra. But by that point, I'd say maybe the damage was done, and that was probably the point. And once we were having that friction over careers, Trent and I were already discussing potential exit strategies.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd add to that, Trent?
That was a question again. You took too long, Julie. I forgot.
Not getting edited out, just to be clear. This remains in the car. That's not going anywhere. I actually think, to be honest, I think Julie answered it really well, which was the question was, how much, if any, did the pressures of being dual serving factor into the consideration to get out? And it sounds like it was a key factor, really. Like had you guys, I don't think it's unfair to say, had you both been feeling supported, you would have both kept serving at least a little bit.
Yeah, and it's not something that we just initially sprung on our career advisors. Like since we started dating, I was a craftsman and Julie was a lieutenant, so it had always been that case throughout our whole posting cycle. Really, was that co-location was our number one aspect. And I was very forthcoming to my career advisor that Julie's career take her further and higher and bigger, better things than mine ever will. So I was willing to accept any sort of posting as long as it was co-located. Yeah, when it got to this time, and my career advisor was very pushed back against that. And then yes, we ended up sorting it out. But by then I'm like, they're not gonna want to keep doing this sort of thing. So it just made perfect sense that, I'd be the one that would start the transition first. Because like, as you said earlier, all roads lead to Canberra for officers, particularly, not so much for, NCOs.
I
So I
think
think that just made
other
sense. So I was the first one to transition.
the other aspect to this is probably some gender bias and acknowledging that, we got out nearly 5 years ago now. So, things continue to change and improve. It was difficult, I suppose, for Army to accept, or my perception would be for Army to accept Trent as the primary carer for our children. Dockham in particular would want to advocate or put me up as an example of a high performing female officer with children and how innovative that was and accommodating. But I was usually pretty quick to point out that I had just replicated their model. We just gender swapped. So I had Trent at home supporting my family, and that enabled me to take those positions, do those deployments, and do those high profile jobs. I would reflect my perception is it was a lot harder for Trent to seek some of the and tap into some of the support networks that Army has built for arguably a lot of spousal support traditionally for females. So when I was an OC, Trent actually was on a flexible work agreement so that we both wouldn't be upfield in Townsville at the same time. And that was conditional of him accepting the job, and it was a vacant position. So the unit either got Trent 4 days a week on that flexible work, which meant that he couldn't do night shifts or deploy outfield, or they'd get no one, and the unit supported that. But when I say supported that, it was supported at a command level. And actually, the day-to-day arrangements that I saw Trent struggle with were actually quite toxic.
Can you speak to that, Trent, if you're comfortable?
Yeah, definitely. Coming from the CO and the OC, always had a lot of support sort of thing from that. A lot of it was, the old crusty woes that sort of might have a, sneaky, sly word that is like, or comment that, oh, why isn't your wife, looking after the kids, or you're trying to skive out of going on night shift and doing the shift work, stuff like that. And it's like, well, my wife's, she's going field, she's an OC. And then, of course, then I'd also get comments that I'm, name dropping that my wife is an OC.
Yeah.
So it was always from
When you're actually literally just explaining what she's doing.
Yeah. So it was really like my peers were fine, sort of thing. They accepted it. There's like, oh yeah, Trent's running back shops and stuff like that. But it's the older generation of guys, that were some 10 years ahead of me. They were, woe ones and woe twos that seemed to have a lot more of an issue with it. And then they reluctantly accepted that was what they were given because it was supported by the CO and signed off by the CO.
Also, reflect that I saw peers, like male peers of mine, struggle to access some of those support mechanisms of flexible work, even if they wanted to, and even like some extended parental leave was questioned. So I think potentially some of the barriers, I suppose, to us continuing to serve was actually the lack of the ability of men to access some of the support systems that Army had built in, but they were culturally not the norm.
And I think that's a really interesting point, which is that, yeah, you're right. There's been improvements in that space, even in the last 5 years, but you can change a policy much faster than you can change an organization's culture. And the culture is still, because it is predominantly men, and because and this is not man bashing, actually. This is about that these pressures on men then are very, very challenging if they want to do something that's perceived as like not traditional. And it's interesting because like in many ways, Trent is a traditional guy, right? Like I'm like, in terms of the trade you do and, not listening when your wife speaks. No, that's me.
But true.
What's that?
Right? Like I'm like, literally the big distinction here that makes you like such an outlier is that you like to spend time with your children and are willing to do that to support your wife. And obviously, Julie, I know you
Yes.
like spending time with your children too, but like, do you know what I mean? Like the fact that that was like the idea of, oh, you're skiving off, and you're like, oh, anyone that says someone who's like the primary caregiver for two kids that, you know, young kids as yours were, is skiving off. I'm like, oh no, honey, work is
Like,
always a holiday. Like,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
like, they've never looked after the kid for a whole month when, your spouse is outfield and stuff like that. So it's bloody draining.
Oh, yeah. I remember when my spouse was away and my kids were little, and we'd have a long weekend and we'd come back and people would go, how was your weekend? And you don't want to say this to like young people who don't have kids, but I was like,
Yeah.
I'm so happy to be here. Like, I'm going to go to the toilet and no one's going to talk to me.
Yep. Yep.
But yeah, I think that's interesting. I spoke to someone the other day, like we did a video around a lot of this stuff, which is that actually, yes, the organization is trying to make change, and there are key people that are making that change, but there's absolutely still work to be done. And it's interesting what you said, Julie, around. I also love. I'm like, you can tell that Julie was a very successful officer, far more than I was in my career. Which is that she goes, well, it was my perception, and I'm like, it's your perception of 20 years in the organization. You got a pretty sound perception, but I appreciate that. I appreciate the caveat. But I think there's really something to that, which is that even with you in writing saying co-location's the priority, even with Trent saying, yes, she is the priority, it is almost incredulity to, oh, he actually wants this and he's not being pressured to. And I saw that with dealing with my spouse when we would say, because we just rotated and we were both officers, which made that easier, right? But we just went, this posting, I'm priority, this posting, his priority. Every time he would do it, they would go, are you sure? Because this is every time, this is a critical time and, you know, you've got to invest here and basically invest here because what if your marriage goes wrong? And I'm like, oh, I'd suggest invest in your marriage because what if this goes wrong? But
Come on, I was always told you're not a real, senior NCO until you've been divorced at least once. I'm like,
true. I
that's
think that's
not.
why you had to leave. Too happily married. That's
Yeah,
the reality. Too happily
exactly
married.
right.
Get out. I think that I appreciate you saying that point around two different career management streams, because I think that is huge. Because even being like psych and infantry in my marriage, officers though, right? Both DOCM, that was an issue of trying to get them to talk to each other. Then you guys are going DOCM schema, and I've obviously dealt with like lots of people with different situations. I've seen people that are two different services, and it's almost worse than if one was a civilian. Actually, I would say it is worse than if one was a civilian. Because
Yeah,
if one was a civilian, that one could at least just follow, and it would suck, but they could. But when it's two different services, and I'm not going to get us cancelled by. There's a specific combo that I'm like, oh, that just don't even go there. But there's a specific combo where I'm like, oh, they will just not talk to each other, and they will not concede that the other service could possibly, that any role in that other service could be more important. And I'm sure you can figure out which two services might be that stubborn, but yeah.
So it got, with our coming back from the US, it actually got to the point that I was competing for Lieutenant Colonel and going to PAC when Schema came back and said they're sending Trent to Darwin. And I knew that there wouldn't be a Lieutenant Colonel pre-command position in Darwin. And I didn't have a ROSO, and Trent still had 6 months of his ROSO to serve. And so I phoned my career agency and withdrew. I was like, I'm going to withdraw from Lieutenant Colonel Pack because you can find me a major's job in Darwin, but you can't find me a Lieutenant Colonel's job, and co-location's our priority. And Army has made the choice as to what Army's needs are. And if they determine the need is Trent being up in Darwin, then co-location's my priority, and I'm happy to wear that. Now, that was the forcing function that actually made my careers advisor go and talk to Trent's careers advisor, because they realized that I was, and people were like, oh, that was pretty, bolshy. I'm like, well, it was the only power I had, like, because otherwise, and that was probably the part in dual service, is you don't have much power. You have preferences, you have some choices, but actually the fear of retribution at an organizational level of you've chosen something that we don't support, so now you're going to be a basket weaver in Timbuktu is kind of always there, and you're not really sure. So yeah, so that was actually how that was the forcing function to get our career managers to speak, was to say, okay, you've decided, you've made a decision that the Army need is Trent and Darwin, and we'll just comply. And that therefore was not acceptable to DOCM, who finally had to go speak to the career advisor on the same floor in the same building to negotiate, I suppose, or come to a position.
It's interesting because I think that Like, I know what you mean. People sort of say that's really bullshit to do that. And I'm like, what, to advocate for your own needs after 15, whatever. But it's true. There's this idea of like, I mean, as officers, I'm sure we've been in those rooms when people have these conversations of they're throwing the toys out of the cot. They're saying they're going to discharge. But what I've always said to what I said to my subordinates, what I say to clients in that environment is I'm like, it's actually not throwing your toys out of your cot. If you are willing to do it, it's actually just really being clear about your boundary and how far it will go. Like, don't ever say it if you don't mean it, because there are times when they'll go, like, it'll all come down to service need and they'll go, fine, go. But if you actually, like, if it's between I'm going to get out or I'm going to take this posting and then my life is going to implode and I'll get out anyway, it's like, just voice it and at least have some power in the moment. And then if they still choose to do it, they choose to do it, but at least you'll know you asked. I find there's a lot of sort of learned helplessness in the organization, just in the sense of I try to enact change, I try to do something and I don't achieve it, and it happens again and again, and so I stop asking. And so it's really natural that people then just give up. But I'm like, oh, you've got to really think about which ones are the ones I am willing to fight for.
I think it probably actually goes to transition. So once you're not wearing a uniform and you have to negotiate your salary and you have to negotiate your next job, or if you're, I currently contract rather than a full-time employee. So I always call it, you have to use your words. And ironically, because a lot of people would say, most people in Army are alpha, types that are very strong-willed and very definitive. I don't think our careers have actually set us up to use our words, to advocate for our own self-interest and to communicate our self-worth, because the career agencies have arguably pushed you into a box where you would have 3 career preferences over 5 years, and that's constrained by an atmosphere of, your performance and your potential overlaid.
And you should be grateful for it too.
Yeah, that's right.
It's sold as career management, but is probably more akin to placement within an organizational posting cycle. And I think that it's probably a place where most people, when they're transitioning, struggle, is how to actually communicate what they want out of their employer and their workplace.
I think you are spot on. I mean, I've lived that myself, right, in terms of transitioning. And it ties into what Trent said then too, in the sense of, and you should be grateful for it. Like, oh, we've done this, this and this. Because I find that now is that because we get just if you work in a psych field that works with veterans, of course you get a lot of mental health people that used to be used to serve, right, or that are veterans, and we sort of have to say to them like, you don't need to ask my permission to have sick leave, and you do not need to thank me for letting you take sick leave. Or like, we had someone recently, and I know he won't mind me sharing the story. He needed some time off. His mother was quite sick, and it was a bit like he didn't know what was going to happen. It was very unexpected, etc. And so, like, when he put that on our little group chat, what he got back was like, mate, you're always here for everyone. Take whatever time you need. We will figure it out. And he said when he got that, he like nearly cried, because he was like, oh, that's so supportive. And I was like, it's just being like a decent human. It's funny because I think that defense is filled with decent humans, but they're sometimes working within a structure that doesn't let you go, just take what time you need, right? Because the person above you is not going to allow that to be the answer. And so you're expected to get like more detail. And
I think a lot of people hide behind process in an organisation as large as defence. And I'd say that those processes don't necessarily exist. And if they are, they're more guidelines than actually true policy that has to be enforced. And I think one of the most empowering moments was actually choosing to resign from my first job. And so I got to a point where it wasn't the work I wanted to be doing. It's not really what I thought I would be doing. Made the decision to leave. And literally the next week was no longer, I had submitted that resignation. I was like, wow, usually that's a 6-month process with multiple interviews and whatever, and it's just done and dusted. I don't actually have to, like, it wasn't a big deal. Whereas in defence, choosing to resign, is a long, protracted, process that can feel
Then you get
very
blacklisted as
personal. You have to
well.
justify all your reasons, you have to write a formal minute, you have to fill out paperwork, and then complete all the separation steps. Whereas resigning from a civilian job's like, I'll have a conversation, submit a letter to formalise it, and it's done. Like it was, I was like, oh, I don't have to be there anymore in a job I don't want. Like, how
6
relieving,
months.
how refreshing, how novel. Like,
interesting too, because as Trent said, and you get blacklisted, which I'm like, yeah, that's the thing, right? Is that in a lot, not all, but in a lot of defence environments across services, I've seen this is once they know you're leaving, it's either, well, we don't give a shit about you because we can't task you, because we can't put you down on the ops thing for C series, whatever. Or like, and that's pretty benign, right? But it's unpleasant of, okay, you just all dump me like a sack of shit. Or it's actually pretty toxic in the sense of it's like the team takes it personally. And it doesn't matter if that team all feels the same way, right? But it becomes like, oh, you don't want to stay with us. And it's like, it's very, very rarely about the team you're working with. I mean, sometimes it is, but I'm like, when I got out, I had a great team. Like I had a really wonderful team who I was truly sad to leave. But for my life, it wasn't right. Defense really, it leverages the fact that we're all people who have a strong drive to serve, who like find our authentic self is teamwork, service, all of that stuff. And then it takes that and it I don't want to say abuses that, but it definitely can. The structure can. One of my colleagues at work, not ex-serving, cracked me up where she was like, I've realized something and I think it's offensive, but I just want to check. Am I right about this? And I was like, oh, this is going to be amazing. I was like, what have you noticed? And she goes, it's a bit like a cult, like in terms of how it like breaks you down, takes your self-worth. Your self-worth only comes from the organization. I'm like, that's spot on. I've talked to quite a few people who are doing these interviews, and something that we keep talking about is that there's no like official thing in policy anywhere that people who serve are better than civilians, right? Like that's not in a PAM anywhere, that's not anywhere. And in fact, there's very clear, you show respect, you say this and that, you don't swear at civilians, etc. But I'm like, yes, but the air that you breathe in terms of the training establishments is, oh, you're better than civilians because you can do this stuff. And then depending on the corps, right? Like infantry, oh well, they're better than all the other corps in the army. And Navy have their equivalent as well, and RAF have. I mean, we've all met pilots. Like there's a cultural element here, which is really, really adaptive in the culture, in the sense of like, if we use that infantry example, if you're digging a pit and it's, -4 in Singleton and all you have is an entrenching tool and it broke, the only thing that's going to get you through is I'm a hard cunt and I can do this and other people can't, right? So it's super adaptive. But then what we have is a perfect storm when people get out and you go, for 10 years, I've been told that those people aren't as good as me. Oh, but now I have to work with them. And actually, maybe I am one. And what does that mean? And I find that is interesting. And I know that the recent inquiry, the Royal Commission, it was something that it identified is that the identity transition space is really, really challenging, even for people that wouldn't necessarily have thought that they had bought into some of that.
Yeah, and it can be really hard. I often see people will reach out when they've made the decision to leave, and they find a safe place with people who have already left. And that's, I think normal and understandable. When I made the decision to leave, it was, yes, there was pending medical issues, but they hadn't forced my hand at that point. But I very much felt the need for a plan B and a good plan B. And then I think the instinct to want to enact that plan B before the medical system really had played out was quite important, or at least very present in my decision making. But a good friend of mine, and I was in a really good job and I really liked the workplace that I was in. And he said, oh, Julie, I don't think this is the right decision for Army, because I shared that I was going to discharge. On top of medical stuff, there was also this, yep, I thank you. That's really flattering, and it's lovely for you to say that. However, at the same time, I need to stop losing. So it was like, what is best for me as an individual was no longer what was best for a collective, and that was really difficult for him as an infantry officer with high potential. Was just like, what do you mean? Like, but we're all about the collective good. And I was like, well, you're all about the collective good until it starts crossing over with your own individual needs and self-preservation. Kind of interesting for him to be sitting there just going, this paradigm doesn't compute with how I perceive service to be. And I was like, yeah, but it was only okay up until I'm like, I've got pending medical issues, conflicting family priorities. And if that's true, then actually my decision-making calculus has to change, and it needs to be about self-preservation as opposed to the collective good. But then are you a traitor? And then people will want to almost make sure that it's not contagious, that one person choosing to discharge in a team, particularly a high-performing team, doesn't suddenly become, they've got 5 or 6 or 10 discharges on their hands as a result.
It is interesting because when that stuff does happen, and when and if it does spread a little bit, depending on what the higher leaders are like, they can view it like, oh, this was because of this person. But actually, like if you look at, like, I'll use my own corps as an example, right? If you look at the discharge rate of like senior captains and majors in psychology corps 21, 22, 23, it's huge. Like, and it's not because a couple of people left and everybody went, wow, that's a great idea. It's because there was an organizational restructure and a whole bunch of us went, the work used to be this and now it's that. And that's not the kind of work that I'm going to find rewarding. And so I'm going to move on and do something else. But there were definitely people who were like, oh, this idea of like, oh, we're just quitters. And I'm like, yeah, I am. Like, I'm a clinical psychologist. I would like to do clinical work. And I guess what was positive is that when I say there were people that were a bit cynical about it, that was probably more in my peers, whereas my actual boss at the time, and I'm going to say her name because she's amazing, Jackie Costello. I would have had her as my CEO my whole career if I could. She was amazing. When I rang her to tell her, and I told her before I'd even been offered a job, I knew I was going to be offered this job, but I was like, I want to do her this courtesy, right? When I told her, she was like, look, that's a real loss for us, but I'm so glad to hear that you're still going to contribute to defence members. If that's how you want to contribute, that's amazing. She was so supportive. And I was like, yeah, because actually, and I think even if it had been anything, even if it had been, I'm going to go and work in drug and alcohol rehab, she would have gone, that's really meaningful work too. Like there's a lot of ways that you contribute to the world and it doesn't all have to be in this sort of paradigm. But you're quite right that there are certain causes where that's a much more challenging idea.
I
What
think
was it
as well
like?
for people that might be listening to this that might still be in and actually be commanders, managers, supervisors.
Mm.
There's also a lesson to be learned as to how you deal with somebody who has shared with you that they intend on discharging or are looking at discharge options. And I think what you gave, Aleesha, was an excellent example of how to manage and make sure that person's contribution still feels valued. My experience was very different. So my boss was like, oh, I have a policy. I don't ever convince somebody to stay if they've decided that they want to leave. And I was like, okay then. All right. The irony was, as that played out, that I think it was the day before I was due my last day in the office. I was having a week off before starting a new job as a civilian. And I get a phone call from the DG Career Management Agency staff officer saying, the DG really wants to meet with you. And I'm like, today's my last day. Is she recalling me from my long service leave, which was okay at the moment? There was no moratorium at that point. And they're like, I'll get back to you. It's like 3 phone calls later. It's like, no, she really wants to meet with you. I'm like, I've signed a contract for my next job. I've done all my, pieces. And this was probably like 4 or 5 months after that discussion with my direct supervisor. And I was like, I'm not sure what she wants to achieve out of this meeting. It's like, oh, she'll come to you. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm still a lieutenant colonel. I'm not going to let a 1-star come out to my home to have a meeting that I don't think is going to result in an outcome. So still came in off leave to meet with the 1-star because I'm indoctrinated. And, really for me just to say, well, everything was in my letter and I'm not sure what you hope to achieve by having this discussion with me. And you're like, sometimes the organization can't respond as quickly as it needs to.
Yeah.
And, in hindsight, I probably would have been better off staying until my medical had been finalised, which took nearly 2 years by the time that process had been completed. And then by the time that process was completed, when they're offering me like non-deployable type continued service, you're so bitter and jaded as to how you've been treated by the organisation up to that point that actually that was no longer an option for me because there was that sort of moral injury of like, but as an organisation, you screwed me over for this period of time. That's no longer an attractive proposition that you're putting in front of me. That's the type of offer you need to say when I first put my discharge into my direct supervisor, saying, hey, I have ongoing medical issues. I've been downgraded. You can't find the source of the injury. There's no chance of upgrade and I'm enacting plan B. Actually, that's the conversation to have at that point in time. It's like, hey, Julie, actually what you're saying to me is you're doing this because of injury. How about we explore non-deployable options and support you through this transition to make sure that we're getting the best outcome for you as an individual while also continuing to have your service and participation in Army or the service. That would have been the right response right back at that first decision point.
Yeah. I think just from what I've seen, commanders are getting better at that. But also I think the mech system is getting better at going, this person's put in an not an admin SEP, sorry, a voluntary SEP, but it's pretty clear that it's because of all this stuff. Let's actually talk to this person. So I've seen improvements there, which is positive. But yeah, I agree that it's not always handled very well. And that, yeah, like you give a lot to the organization and you sort of hope for a certain amount of support or flexibility. When you don't get it, you're like, well, what would keep me when I've got other options? Or
Yeah, and I've had people say to me, I didn't intend on going back to defence in a contracting or consulting role, but then I found I missed some of the purpose behind the work that I was doing, and that's really where I found myself coming back to. But now I've had many people who have managed me on contracts or I've worked directly to who lament the irony that I get discharged because I can't run. But I've worked for those people for 3-4 years, and not once have they required me to run. But geez, their life would be easier if I could wear a uniform and be a Commonwealth representative for them. Which hopefully, again, things have changed in 5 years, and that's always a positive trajectory. And I hope that there are other people that don't get treated in the same way as me, and do continue to serve, even if it is a non-deployable role.
Thank you again, Trent and Julie, for giving me your time. I really appreciate that we were able to kind of get that perspective from a dual serving couple, which I think is really helpful. Equally, I think that Trent has some really important things to say about his experiences as a man who in some ways is like a stereotypical man. He's a tradie, loves working with his hands. Equally, really wants to be a good dad. And that was a big factor in some of the challenges that they faced, is how was Trent able to be a primary caregiver when he wished to be. So to honour that and to honour those challenges that are a little bit different, I've also interviewed Trent separately. You can find his podcast as well. I will make sure the link is in the show notes for this. Thank you, everyone, for listening, for engaging. People have been reaching out and saying how much they're enjoying the pod, which means so much to me. Especially a few people have said that they don't know me, but for them, it feels like they're like sitting in the car with friends. And that's exactly the vibe I was going for. And I hope that we can continue that. Sometimes I interview people I know, like Trent and Jules. My first podcast that a few people have commented on I didn't know but I endeavor to make people feel like they're chatting with an old friend as well. I think it's really important that we get different stories out there and we talk about some of these things. And the reason we're able to talk about some of these things as freely as we do is because, as a disclaimer, nothing that we say is approved by the Department of Defence or the various employers that we might discuss. This is just our own personal opinions, sharing our own experiences of the world. And I truly value everyone who has given me the time to do that. And everybody who's reached out with comments, please keep going. Please keep sharing. We're on Spotify, we're on YouTube, we're anywhere we can get ourselves so that this message can go out to the people who need it. And if one person hears it and gets benefit from it, then every hour I've spent on this is meaningful to me. So thank you so much to everybody who's sharing it. I hope to see you again in a week or two.